Good afternoon. Welcome to CSEP's flagship seminar titled Global and Local Policies for Respecting Planetary Boundaries. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Thomas Hurtel, distinguished professor at Purdue University and founder of the Global Trade Analysis Project, GTAP. And with the presence of Dr. Vivadhavan and Dr. Anshu Bharadwaj from TERI and Niti Aayog, and of course, our very own senior fellow, Dr. Rajesh Chadha. We couldn't really have asked for a better panel today. This is an extremely important topic for us at CSEP. We commenced on this path of building our own modeling capacities about 4 years back. And I'm happy to report that today this group of modelers at CSEP under Dr. Rajesh Chadha's guidance is steadily becoming a key part of our climate change and sustainability research. The simultaneous challenges of equitable growth and climate-related transition together require a great balancing act going forward. Policymakers must allocate limited resources to multiple objectives in a world where technologies are still inadequate to the task at hand, and of course, information is sparse. Modeling has the tremendous capacity to inform policymakers on the various challenges and policy alternatives before them, and the varied impacts that the different options may have. The work that started under Professor Hurtel's leadership many decades back has become even more important today than ever before. And with the presence of Dr. Vivadhavan and Dr. Anshu Bharadwaj here today, we look forward to a highly illuminating conversation. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Chadha.
Thank you. Thank you, Lavish, for your kind words. And a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you very much, Professor Hurtel, Dr. Dhawan, Dr. Bharadwaj, for being with us this afternoon. I hope it's working. Okay. So I think that the title of the topic that we are going to discuss is the global and local policies for respecting planetary boundaries, trade-offs, and synergies. I've been given only limited 3 minutes time to myself, so I'll be very brief in introducing the topic of the day, and with a very warm welcome to our panelists and the speaker, I wish to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Rakesh Mohan, President Emeritus and Distinguished Fellow at CSEP. He has provided a major push to the CGE-related work in India. Thank you very much. And you have been the moral booster while at NCAER and took me into the first bilateral trade agreement CGE work for India-Singapore. Professor Hurtel delivered his work as the work that he's going to present today, he delivered as the plenary alumnist lecture at the ongoing International Conference of Agricultural Economists being held at the National Agricultural Science Complex, Indian Council of Agricultural Research, Pusa, New Delhi. So thank you for finding time out of your busy schedule at the conference. Professor Hurtel is a distinguished professor of agricultural economics at Purdue University, West Lafayette. His research and teaching focus on international trade, food, and environmental security. He is a 2022 recipient of the Alexander von Humboldt Research Prize. He is a fellow and past president of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, a fellow of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, as well as the Australasian Agricultural and Resource Economic Society, and an honorary life member of the International Association of Agricultural Economists. Professor Hurtel is the inaugural recipient of the Purdue University Research and Scholarship Distinction Award. His professional association awards include Publication of Enduring Quality, Distinguished Policy Contribution, Outstanding Journal Article, and Quality of Communication. In 2023, he received the Spirit of the Land Grant Mission Award. He is the founder and executive director of Global Trade Analysis Project, GTAP, a family of researchers which commenced in 1992 with 30 people to 30,000 today. That's the family size from 30 to 32. I have been a part of it since 1994. Before moving to the presentation by Professor Hurtle, personally, it is a memorable day for me, August 6. I attended the second short course on General Equilibrium Modeling Package, GEMPAC, held at GTAP Purdue University, commencing at the end of July through the first week of August 1994. I had a flight to take to Michigan to start working with Bob Stern and Alan Deardoff on CGE modeling. But I think my course mate, Alan Fox, convinced me to travel by car so that I can see the countryside. And by the way, this was the afternoon of August 6, 30 years ago, three decades ago. And somehow it's the constellation of stars that is making us meet. One of my many queries during the short course included, why did the GTAP database not have India in it? Professor Hurtle's, as we call him lovingly, Tom's response was, if you have a problem, help fix it. I have been contributing the India database ever since 1995. I now hand it over to Professor Hurtle, and I shall introduce the panelists as we move along after the discussion. So 35 minutes to you, Tom. All yours.
Thank you. Okay, can I advance the slides? Do we have the slides here? Yeah, and clicker? Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Professor Chadha, for such a warm and wonderful introduction. It is a great honor to be here. Actually, he tried to arrange for my visit to New Delhi some decades ago, and through a snafu on my side, I never quite made it. But so we're particularly happy. I'm particularly happy to be here at long last, and it's an honor to be here at CSEP. I've heard so many wonderful things about this organization, and I'm in the research going forward now. So yeah, it's a pleasure to give this talk to you. It was prepared for the conference that I'm attending here in Delhi, but I think it's broadly applicable, and it actually will show you a roadmap of what I've been doing over the last 10 years. So actually, as others have moved into the leadership of GTAP, I've looked for opportunities to extend our frontiers beyond economists into other disciplines, now that we've got 30,000 people involved in GTAP, I'm seeking to connect the GTAP network to other networks. And you'll see we have now a National Science Foundation funded network of networks of a dozen different networks, all seeking to address these global challenges that I'll talk about today. So without further ado, let me move ahead. That's the GlassNet, by the way. So GTAP is part of GlassNet. So this presentation will focus on the food system, and in particular, how the food system is driving us beyond planetary boundaries in a number of ways. So for those not familiar with it, the planetary boundaries have been under discussion since about 2007, 2008, a series of papers, high-profile papers in Science, Nature, this least recent one in Science Advances, led by biophysical scientists, not economists, and focusing on tipping points, critical things that could make the planet unlivable or radically change the way we can live on this planet. And you can see climate change is one of these, but also there are other planetary boundaries that are equally important, and we don't think about perhaps as much, but the pollution of our waterways, especially through the biogeochemical flows, nitrogen, phosphorus, fertilizer. I heard a lot about that at this conference on agriculture. All of the nitrogen fertilizer being applied in excess and ending up in groundwater, surface water. But we also have biodiversity loss. Those two are actually a greater risk, according to these scientists, than even the climate crisis, which we're keenly aware of. Land system change, freshwater change. These are things that agriculture is really driving. There are projections. I participated in a paper for the UN Food Systems Summit for the there we projected that these would be under a business as usual baseline, even further pushed out into higher risk areas. So my theme today and my mantra over the last decade has been global to local to global analysis. So with GTAP, I think we managed to really advance global economic analysis of many issues, trade policy, climate mitigation, other kinds of things. But as I began to work on these issues, I realized we needed to connect at a local level. So many of these sustainability challenges are location specific. I was talking about, for example, nitrogen fertilizer. On average, maybe the fertilizer applications aren't so high in India. The fact is, it's in the Punjab, in very particular areas that it's dramatically in excess. And as a result, you have in very specific locations, water quality problems. The same is true with groundwater. You know, I'll show you a map later on. Of course, northern India just heats up like very hot in that heat map. But on average, maybe things are okay. We've got to get down to the local level to understand the sustainability challenges. The characteristics, whether it's community governance, weather, soils, these vary locally as well. So you need the local resolution, but these stresses are driven by global forces, population, trade, income growth. You need to connect the global to the local. But also, as I'll show you, when you respond to these challenges at the local level, there are spillover effects. You intervene here to stop excess groundwater withdrawals. Well, the production moves over there. So global to local to global is my theme today, and I'm going to illustrate that. I'm going to illustrate that by looking at 4 of these planetary boundary challenges. So I'll linger on biodiversity for a while because there's been less work done on that, and it's something we're trying to push forward. I'll also talk about climate change mitigation. Of course, a lot has been done on that. And my message in this lecture is very much about where we need more economics involvement. And of course, there's a lot of great economics work now, including Nobel laureate work on climate change. So I won't linger there very long. I am going to spend some time then on these local issues and show you how we can undertake global to local global analysis of nitrate pollution from agriculture, groundwater depletion. So that's the roadmap. Biodiversity. This is a paper from Nature just a couple of years ago, bending the curve of terrestrial biodiversity, and that's the baseline out of a number of integrated assessment models showing what we've lost in the past and what we're likely to lose in the future. And they emphasize that the main driver behind this is agriculture, land use change driven by agriculture. And we're currently on a path, according to these assessments, obviously a lot of uncertainty, but according to these assessments, to lose 13% of suitable habitat, 54% of wildlife density by the end of the century. The thing about biodiversity, once again, you need the local resolution. It's not on average, it's not an average issue. Biodiversity, the threats to biodiversity are highly localized, okay? Here you can see where you have high degree of threatened taxa. It's in very specific locations. So when we're thinking about global drivers of this, population growth or income growth, increased consumption, it's a question of economic geography. You stimulate, you have population growth in Africa. Where does that stimulate demand growth? Is it in Africa? Is it elsewhere? It depends on trade. Depends on a whole host of things. Okay, right. These are species that are threatened. And the number of species that are threatened in a given location. Sorry, I didn't clarify that. And please keep interrupting me. And the IUCN is the international organization assessing biodiversity. So I want to delve into this a little bit, just focusing on one of the global drivers, and that's demography. So I'm not going to talk supply side, just think demand side for a minute. In a way, it's the most elemental thing when you're talking about food. Because really, since the beginning of time, the number of mouths, that's been the main driver of food demand. Not so in the future because of changing demographic trends. It's more income growth going forward, but demography in the past has been the driver. And we're at the cusp of dramatic changes in demography, okay? Just look back 20 years at the population growth, say in China. The red bar showing the percentage growth over the last 20 years. In the future, declining population. Is that going to open an opportunity for biodiversity, for recovery? That's really an empirical question. And we were surprised by the answer, actually. We were hoping that it would open more opportunities. We didn't find that. So in the future, slower population growth, lesser absolute additions in the aggregate, but a different profile. So much more emphasis in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is where the population growth is going to be occurring in the future. So those are the demographic drivers. Now let's explore the implications, purely demand side, implications of that those population trends. Well, first of all, let's do a historical analysis. So here we are using the GTAP model. I won't be using it throughout, but I did need to work in some GTAP stuff here. And this is using a version that has agroecological zones broken out. And you can see this is a heat map showing this historical population growth. Where was it causing increased potential for species loss? So potential species loss is the way we're assessing biodiversity. There are many ways to do that. I talked about habitat loss before, wildlife density. Here I'm focusing on potential species loss. So that 20-year growth shows, largely heavily through the tropics. But what's most interesting is to contrast that with, backing up for just a minute. Let's stick with the historical one for a moment and let's look at a heat map, okay? So this heat map shows population drivers along the top and biodiversity losses on the rows. So going down a column, population growth in the US is mostly red. Going down there means that over that historical period, if you just focused on increment to population in the US, it was causing increased risks of species loss in most regions and quite extensive impacts. EU as well. Japan and Russia, green. Why? Because population growth was already declining in those regions. China is still red here over the historical period. We go forward and contrast the heat map with the next 20 years projections, and this is from the UN Population Division. EU turns green, okay? Why? Because there's population now is starting to decline there. So that seems like it would open an opportunity for maybe some biodiversity recovery. But you see Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, really deeper red. They're wealthier now and population is growing strongly. So a shifting, the global drivers for biodiversity loss are shifting, and this economic geography comes into a play. And so we find that these global drivers are continuing to induce biodiversity loss in the future, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is pretty much coming from Africa. Yeah, let me finish this and then come to you. So global drivers, 95% confidence interval, almost the same as the 95% confidence interval, and the impacts just from Africa alone. Really, all the demographic pressure now is coming from Africa, even just in the next 2 decades. And that's also the big source of uncertainty. I mean, you might think 20 years, that's nothing in demographic time. We're all, going to be around hopefully in 20 years. But there's a lot of uncertainty in these projections for Africa. And so that's what's really driving the potential uncertainty in biodiversity loss. And that's why we didn't find a lessening in the aggregate biodiversity losses over the next 20 years relative to the last 20 years. So the geography comes into play. Fewer people being added, but the geography is such that connecting with the biodiversity hotspots, that we're not going to experience a lessening of pressure. Yes, question.
In the biggest graph where you show the impact, this is purely from demographics, so you remove the economic aspect.
It's all economics, but only driven by the demand, the population demand. So I'm not changing the labor supply here. I'm not changing the technology. I'm not changing the capital. So if you decompose these in the way that some of the general equilibrium modelers, Ganesh, would do here, you run the model, but you do some numerical integration and get the subtotal effects, you would find that population is pushing up on the biodiversity losses, technology is pushing down. So I just isolated the biodiversity here, the population drivers, the demand side, because the whole picture is pretty complex. This is a paper currently under review. We'll see what the reviewers say, but I wanted to emphasize the connection to demography, but that's an excellent point. Another question here? Yeah.
Can you just explain
Yes,
what
go back.
happens when we move from left to right?
Um,
It's when how the population changes. Does that?
So each column shows the effect of population growth in that region over the historical period or in the future period on all of these different countries and regions. So going down the column, you see the effect. Let's go over to Nigeria here. Yeah, okay, that's the effect of Nigeria's population growth in the next 20 years on each of these regions, and it's hot red all the way down. Did I answer your question, or did you want to go further?
From left to right.
From left to right, it's organized by per capita income. Yeah, largely. That's why. Yeah, good question. Here, yeah.
So what's the rationale behind why the impact on China from the United States is green? Or
there are a million questions in this heat map. We haven't answered all of them. So that's one I haven't answered, but it bears exploration. So this is, once it's peer reviewed, we'll put the files up there, and one of your experts here can explore that further. There was a question here.
So what's the time frame for biodiversity recovery?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're better at assessing the losses than assessing the gains, because biodiversity recovery can take a long time. It depends on the local ecosystem and whatnot. So basically, in this framework, we're thinking about species loss or not species loss. But that's an excellent question. Let me keep going a bit here, because I want to get to a few other points. There's this question of mutualism that I want to touch on briefly. One of the big topics at this conference I've been attending now, is the ecological connections from agriculture. So agricultural ecology links, agroecology is the terminology. And I've spent some time working with ecologists on this, and they identify biodiversity as a potential input into agriculture. So if we ignore it and have these adverse effects by homogenizing the landscape and pushing out the natural frontier, we find that yields decline. So taking that into account, that mutualism into account, is important and can be beneficial. Of course, if your yields decline and you push more out on the extensive margin, then there'll be an incentive. Then you'll further degrade yields, and there's an incentive, potential for adverse feedback. That's the point I was trying to make here. That's a particular interest to the agroecologists. And this is an area they've studied a lot, pollinator dependency. So you can see, depending on how far you are away from the natural habitat, there's an impact on your yields. And it turns out natural pollination supports 90% of global production, ag production, 70%, 90% of the crops providing critical micronutrients. A lot of the fruits and veggies, for example, which we want to consume more of, they depend on natural pollinators. Natural pollinators depend on natural habitat. Natural habitat depends on how far we pushed out with the intensive production. So there's a mutualism there, and I wanted to explore that a little more from the economic perspective. And so part of this GlassNet project involved connecting this guy in the lower right to the guys on the left. Okay, so here's our GTAP community on the left, and on the right is the natural capital community, a bunch of ecologists. So we figured out a way to connect the two. It involves running the GTAP model and getting results like on the left. And that's a baseline per decade out to 2030. So all the things, demand, supply, labor, everything's in there in that baseline. And we look at how land use changes in that baseline. And then these guys downscale it to a very fine scale, 300 meters. So they're kind of at the field level. Then they can look at things like pollination services and six different ecosystem services. I'll just focus on the pollinators here. So we have a circular connection here, whereby you run the GTAP model in the baseline, you see, you're degrading the natural habitat. That's going to have an effect on pollinators. Pollinators are going to have an effect on productivity. That's going to feed back. So we established that, and this is published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences last year. This was kind of the first big output of the GlassNet project. And so up on the top, you see what this looks like, this crazy downscaled, amazing detail for a particular area. I think this is in Ghana. And you can see the different land use types and whatnot in a scenario. You see the effect on pollinator sufficiency, and you see the effect then on productivity, C. And D feeds that back to the GTAP model through productivity, which is a shock to the GTAP model. You run that around like this, and you get these results, which are aggregated. So you can say at a macro level, protecting nature or not has this effect on GDP or aggregate welfare. So it's really the first time anyone has made that connection. And there's been huge interest. Central banks have been surprisingly been interested in this. Of course, the World Bank was behind this as World Wildlife Fund, wanting to get this discussion into the mainstream, into the Ministry of Finance, to make this connection. So what these results showed was that the biggest welfare damages, this is equivalent variation. So we went from this ecologist stuff down here to macro equivalent variation at the regional level. The low-income countries are most severely hit by the loss of natural capital in the baseline. It's not surprising when you think about it. Like most of these modeling results, afterwards you realize, oh, I should have known that. Why? Because big primary sector depends a lot on natural capital. So proportionately, they're going to be the big losers if you degrade that. So what if you protect it? And of course, how do you protect it? And so in this case, it's repurposing agricultural subsidies. I mean, that was the first thing the World Bank guys thought of. Okay, let's take this money from here and put it here. So where do we put it? Well, protection, for example, payments for ecosystem services at the national or global level, subsidized agricultural R&D. That's a popular one. We're always under investing in that. India's under investing in that. Big returns to that. So let's try that out and see what the impacts are. Well, it turns out, hard to read, but on the left of the right-hand panel B, on the left side are the welfare gains from each of these policies. And the aggregated combined policies, you can see they're significant for the low-income countries. So they lose the most under business as usual. They gain the most under a conservation kind of policy. So that was an important finding, generated a lot of interest and established this methodology. I want to look a little further into this. How real is this? The biggest gain here is from supporting further R&D for agriculture. So higher productivity in agriculture, more with less, use more with less. Does that conserve nature? And it's actually a debate around that because if you make a sector more efficient, there's something called Jevons paradox, going back to the coal and the Industrial Revolution. If you make the sector more efficient, they become more profitable. Are they going to expand and just gobble up more resources or not? So there's a Jevons paradox we need to explore here, and it turns out it's rather subtle. So to do that, we wanted to go back in time. We went back all the way to the beginning of some of the FAO data that we were using here. So we're focused on agricultural R&D, going back to 1970, and now we're moving from GTAP to a global gridded modeling framework. So I'll talk more about this. About to publish a book like the GTAP book Rajesh, that now it's for simple G, and we're working on integration of these two approaches. Right now, I'm going to show you this gridded model, why it's so interesting in this case. So we run that back in time, and then we run it forward. And that's our business, our baseline. So running it from 1970 to 2015. Then we run it again, and we take away the modern varieties that were at the heart of the Green Revolution, but also many national research agencies. That was so modern varieties were part of this whole innovation package. Let's take them away and see what the difference is. So baseline minus the modern without the modern varieties, that's the impact of this technological revolution in history. What was the impact? Well, here you can see the land use impacts on the right. And you can see the lower right, there's some hotspots there. So remember, there were biodiversity hotspots and there are technology hotspots, Jevons paradox. So Jevons paradox applies in some cases and not in others. Why? Because in some cases, it really made them profitable enough. They expanded despite the fact that they needed less land per unit output. So it's a geographic question. So how does that work out for biodiversity? In the aggregate, these modern varieties were biodiversity sparing, okay? You can see amphibians, birds, mammals, plant species. These are potential species losses avoided by the modern varieties. And those are 95% confidence intervals there. So some uncertainty, but I think we can say reduced potential species loss. But it wasn't uniform. You can see Southern Africa, there were hotspots of Jevons paradox. There was likely additional species loss there. So it's a nuanced thing. We can't look at this in the aggregate. We've got to look at it at a fine scale. Briefly on climate change, I'm going to stay with this R&D thing for a moment because there's a through line here on the R&D question. This just shows you been collaborating a lot with this fellow on the lower right, Keith Fugely, who's the kind of the world's guru on agricultural R&D and productivity growth. You can see in agriculture, greenhouse gas emissions have increased with input use. Green line is input use in agriculture. Orange line is greenhouse gases. So they move together. So, well, TFP growth, that's what TFP growth is. It enables you to grow output faster than inputs. That's the blue line. So here's if you can boost productivity growth, of course, you can ensure food security, even though you're mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So that's not the case if you go in and require all the farmers to change their technology to be more environmentally friendly and their costs go up and food prices go up. That's a different story. So this is friendly to the environment and food security if you can generate novel innovations that allow you to potentially, even as in the rich countries, reduce your input use. So here we just a forthcoming paper in the annual review of resource economics, contrasting from these studies, what's the abatement cost, the marginal abatement cost through the R&D channel, and you can see it compares very favorably to the EU carbon price. So this is kind of an underappreciated avenue for greenhouse gas mitigation. Agriculture, with a third of greenhouse gas, contributing about a third to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is something we need to be thinking more about. Nitrate pollution from agriculture. This is a different avenue. This is not the usual global pollutant. This is a local consideration. This just shows you in the US, what's known as the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Large. We've been unable over the last 2 decades to shrink this dead zone despite a lot of efforts. And most of it's coming from agriculture in the Corn Belt. But it's not just in the US, as you would know here. It's around the world, areas of eutrophication. That's what this dead zone is known as, linked to excessive fertilizer use in the river basins, mostly in agriculture. So it's a global phenomenon. How are people thinking about it? The physical scientists, the ones writing about this, publishing about this in the influential interdisciplinary journals, okay? You don't see a lot of economics papers picked up in, the New York Times science section. It's the papers in Science and Nature. They're the ones who get out there. And who's writing these papers? They're not economists on this topic. So here on the left, we have feeding 10 billion people within planetary boundaries. On the right, we have one focused on nitrogen fertilizer, particularly. The one on the left was also emphasizing that. The one on the right, it's quite striking. This paper says, oh, we can do it. This isn't a problem. You just take the fertilizer being used in China and you move it to sub-Saharan Africa. Boom, you're done, okay? We have fed the world. We've stayed within the planetary boundaries. This is the way they're doing the analysis. Now, they may acknowledge, sorry, they may acknowledge some limitations, but that's the state of the art, okay? It's clearly from the economics perspective, it's not that useful because they're not talking about something that can be achieved. There's no policy here, but this has been a jumping off point for us. They've done a lot of hard work to do this analysis. So with the gridded modeling, because we're working down at the level they're working at, we can embed their analysis in our economic model. And with that, we can begin to look at policy. So that's what we've done here in this GlassNet workshop. It hasn't been published yet, but the three people down on the bottom there are the biophysical scientists, and the one on the left is the economist, worked together to look at the implications through this economic lens of taxing nitrate leaching at the grid cell level, okay? So that's the externality. Tax the producer in their nitrogen purchases according to the leaching rate. Now, it's an idealized policy, but it's a policy that we can think about. And there is some reallocation, okay? You can see that leaching goes up in Africa. Why? Because they're using more fertilizer. Why? Because fertilizer is cheaper. Why? Because they're using less of it in China. So it's a market-mediated spillover, okay? So there is some reallocation, some market-mediated spillover, but it's through channels, economic channels. Yep. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Thank you. So the red here is areas of leaching reduction. And why are they reducing leaching? Because we're taxing them.
That's good.
Please.
And that's good.
That's good, yeah. Bad choice of color scheme. Thank you. Very, very sharp. It's an obvious mistake we made. We gotta, when we publish this, we'll have improved it, hopefully. It should be green. So good stuff in the red, bad stuff in the green. Oh dear, we really got that turned around. So, but yeah, a lot of red in Northern India, a lot of red in China, a lot of red in Europe and US. And so what's happening, they're reducing their nitrogen applications, reducing leaching to a planetary boundary defined locally, local boundary. That means that fertilizer is free to go somewhere else. There's also a supply curve, and so less is produced, but some of it gets reallocated through markets. So market-mediated spillovers are key in this story. This is an example of that. Production effects. So again, it's not all, it has some impact on food security, but the price impacts are surprisingly modest. Why? Because there's a lot of adjustment. And part of that adjustment is the fact that when you take fertilizer, there's a curve like this that's called the Gompertz curve, agronomists produce. And it's embedded in the model. And the people up here in China, Northern India, they apply a little more fertilizer. They don't get a lot more out of it. You get a lot more leaching. But the folks in Africa, or even elsewhere in India where it's reallocated, they're down here on the Gompertz curve, high marginal product. So if you can take the fertilizer from a low marginal productivity area, put it in a high marginal productivity area, you can help offset some of the adverse food security effects. You maintain output and production, and prices don't go up that much. So that's an important spillover effect. That's why we need local to global. Okay, what happens on the phone, in this grid cell actually has spillover effects. And this just shows you there are some potential synergies that arise as well here in Northern India, for example. If you go after the excessive nitrate applications, you get some groundwater benefits because they're also overusing their groundwater. Do I have 5 more minutes?
Yeah. You have
Okay.
5 minutes.
Groundwater, quick run through groundwater. Another very interesting case, another one very relevant to India. This is groundwater stress around the world. And you can see we're heating up right here in India a lot because it's just being drawn down very quickly. I've just been hearing about that at this conference, how severe the problem is. So what happens? Up to now, the only publications examining this in a serious way, up until 2 years ago when we did this, were from hydrologists. And the hydrologist, this is one of the world's famous hydrologists out there in the media a lot, something in the New York Times just recently. Vanishing groundwater, this is going to translate into skyrocketing food prices, profound economic political ramifications. And it makes sense. I mean, if you do the arithmetic, and you take rid of all the production that's currently relying on unsustainable groundwater, you're getting a 12–13% reduction in food production. Holy mackerel. Price is going to go through the roof. They may triple, a lot of hungry people. So that's very scary. And that's what a hydrologist should be reporting, okay? But an economist jumping into this says, aha, there's some adaptation mechanisms. Let's explore those. First one is, well, you might use more surface water, okay? In some places, there's surface water availability. In this little gridded model, we have a groundwater supply schedule, but we also have a surface water supply schedule. So they move to surface water. In some cases, they also invest in new irrigation equipment. They might just let this irrigated, land go into rain-fed production. Not everywhere, but there's some places where yields will fall, but it can revert to rain-fed production. It depends on alternative uses. Relocation. It might just move to another place in India. You notice we've eroded this production decline quite a bit. Now add international trade, import more food from the areas that are water abundant, and we're left with a very small reduction. Now, this was absolutely shocking, not just for us, but our co-author here, Chris Perry, he used to be deputy director of the International Water Management Institute here in South Asia, career in the World Bank. He's an economist who works with hydrologists. He said, you guys are crazy. I'm going to take my name off this paper. So we had to really work hard with him. He started tackling each of these blue bars. So he said, there's not a lot of surface water you can go to. Actually, if the groundwater stress, the surface water stress. So we took that away. Take that out of the model. What happens is prices respond more, the other bars respond more, and we could not get this decline to be more than 1%, no matter what. He would tackle this, tackle that. In the end, he said, wow, this is interesting. And he started telling other people about this discovery. And the hydrologists, oh my God, this is an example where economic input has great value. We need to be more engaged on these planetary boundary issues. But it's not all a rosy story. The employment impacts can be dramatic. Look at this. Northern places in northern India, 50% decline in employment in irrigated agriculture. So, global, local, global. Globally, the price effect's not that dramatic, but locally, very dramatic impacts on communities. So this is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about ever since I cut my teeth early on. I'm pointing to Rajesh because early days we were all working on trade policy. And we kind of assumed in the US at least, workers would move around. Okay, this industry's hit, whether China shot, they would move into another sector. It didn't happen in the US in much of manufacturing. We still have communities that are tremendously depressed. So we need to be worried about this in the face of these major conservation policies could have dramatic local effects, and those communities might not adjust easily. So we've been working with labor economists. Here, the person leading this, Sarboshi Ray, she actually studied and worked here in New Delhi before coming to the States. We've been working with labor economists to build into the conventional model up here, which assumes labor markets are fluid, local labor markets. So we worked with labor economists, and all of those lines in the middle there, those are labor markets identified by labor economists. And you can see incorporating explicit labor markets has strong equity impacts. It affects the effectiveness of the policies. So I'm going to stop here, just reiterating the fact that global, local, global is important. a big role for economists to play in this. And we've got this GlassNet community that I'm really trying to encourage people, just as I did 30 years ago with GTAP, now with GlassNet. And you can see we're connecting GTAP to ecologists, hydrologists, and many other communities. So we look forward to involving some of you. We have early career scholar exchanges, a special issue in environmental research letters around these themes, and a book coming out any day now. Thank you. Sorry for going a little over time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Tom, for
Thanks.
a wonderful presentation. And for those who might have found this as many slides, if you can write to us, we can provide you the paper as well as the PowerPoint presentation. We have Professor Hurtle's permission for that. So you please write to us when we will share with you. For those who are at CSEP, it is already shared on the calendar invite. And those who would like to receive it, we will share the paper as well as the PowerPoint presentation, since it involves a lot of cross-cutting experiences. That is my first observation. My second observation, Tom, is that we used to have the conference dinner at your place because we were 30. Now that the conference involves 350 people, it is obviously organized in a different city every year called GTAP Annual Conference. And of course, Tom is there every time, but I've been to many. It's become a big gathering. The only thing I'm now understanding is with GlassNet, probably it is going to multiply even more. So good research should be done. And it also kind of relates with the groundwater issues and land use issues. Also kind of have a presence in the discussions that we are currently doing on the mineral and mining policies. They're very closely connected with what you have presented on the land use issues and water, in water in particular. I see that in GTAP, we already have those who are not initiated to GTAP, Global Trade Analysis Project, is both a model as well as a database of 179 or 160 countries plus, and 65 sectors of production in release 11. So what innovations are being done in the GTAP database, which we are going to pick up soon, are the agroeconomic zones, AEZ, GTAP AEZ. GTAP energy is already available, so we will be going through that as well as. I'm very happy to hear that GTAP is also developing a critical minerals sectors, so that those who are working on critical minerals can also have access to GTAP database for solutions. And one of the very interesting things that I came to now know during last couple of days with another colleague from GTAP, Badri, visiting us, that we can have a My GTAP for India. My GTAP will have all other countries as model, as in the model database, but My GTAP will have My India as a SAM, social accounting matrix, so that we can do country experiments along with the multi-country experiments. So that is what is something very interesting that we found, Tom, and we will be definitely pursuing this idea further. One more thing, and that is in the paper, what you have said is that 2009 to onwards to 2023, there have been many studies by geologists or hydrologists about the boundaries that should not be breached, and 4 of them have been already breached. 3 of them involve food as the issue. Let us remind ourselves, and I reminded Professor Hurtle in the earlier discussion, that I went back to the GTAP 3 conference that I attended. I attended many, but GTAP 3 in Melbourne. We have 2 sessions on, by the way. So it is 2000, quarter century ago, that GTAP had visualized the climate change issues. And there were two parallel sessions on greenhouse gases, pollution and abatement, decomposing carbon leakage, and energy substitution in CGE models. So I think the backdrop begins 25 years ago. And the only thing is I was presenting a trade paper, that's a different thing, but I attended those events also. So all in the interest of particularly, I think India's relevance to this through agroeconomic zones and what is happening to the agroeconomy of Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP. Tom has heard that probably in the conference that was going on. Now I move to the discussants. I will invite Dr. Vibha Dhawan to speak first. Dr. Dhawan, Director General, the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. She is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, India, and serves as an adjunct professor at Michigan State University. She has authored 6 books and over 50 publications, significantly contributing to scientific research. Dr. Dhawan's leadership in research and policy development is recognized nationally and internationally. She is a task force member of various national committees and the Network Strategy Council that advises the UN's Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Previously, she co-chaired the T20 task force on clean energy and green transitions. She led the establishment of the National Center of Excellence in Green Port and Shipping and DBT TERI Center on Advanced Biofuels. Dr. Dhawan has held key roles with Asia Pacific Consortium on Agriculture Biotechnology, the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, and the Borlaug Institute of South Asia. She has served on boards of prestigious organizations and developed significant biotechnological advancements with recent research focusing on biofuels. A very warm welcome, Dr. Dhawan, and over to you for 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. And I should say that after the interesting lecture by Tom, there's hardly anything that I should be talking about. But then let me.
Where's the, oh, yeah.
Perfect. So basically, because I'm an agriculture biotechnologist and now working with TERI, and therefore the issues related to climate change and sustainability, they become very close to the heart. And I'm basically trying to look into what is happening in agriculture, what are the impacts of climate change, and what's the world is going to look like in the future. Now, if we look at India, it's a unique country in the sense that on one hand, we have small and marginal farmers. Our population is still growing. We have less of land availability per capita and more so in terms of water availability. So if we look at challenges, there are far many. If we look at the use of nitrogen fertilizers, especially those dealing with nitrogen, the government subsidizes urea to almost 90%. So therefore, for the farmer, it is available at a price which is affordable to the farmer. And somewhere they loses respect for that what amount of urea should be applied to the crop otherwise. Challenge number 2 over there is that in most of the countries, urea is applied through urea applicator. And therefore, very less is contributing to GHG. You are putting it under the soil, and therefore, you're only worried about one pollution, and that is water pollution. But here we have to look into air as well as water. But then at the same time, you want food to be available at affordable price to masses. And therefore, urea has to be subsidized and given to the farmers. Point number 2, and that is again, I always say that it's the distorted pricing of water. Same challenge, you want food to be available at affordable price. And therefore, most governments, they give water, electricity free for agriculture purposes, or it's highly subsidized. And it also becomes a political issue. The moment you want to touch pricing of water, you can actually lose, the government can lose elections and there will be unrest all over. And therefore, it becomes such a sensitive topic that no one wants to talk about it. Now, what is it leading to? And you did mention in your talk about Punjab. It's also resulting in the salinity levels of the soil going up. It's also resulting in many soils which were fit for agriculture, in a way becoming unfit for agriculture. You did mention about the population, or rather the land use. And I'll say one of the good examples, and you might have gone to the neighboring township of Gurgaon. Now, many years back, and I do remember there were very good fields over there. And now they all are, the good agriculture land has been converted into concrete slum. So that is again the population pressure, which is resulting in loss of good agriculture land. The buffer zone between the forest and agriculture land, that has also completely disappeared. And thus there is pressure on the forest, there is pressure on agriculture. Let's also look into what is happening in agriculture biodiversity. We are losing it at a pace that no one had ever imagined. And when we say loss of biodiversity in terms of the varieties of crops we are growing, it is also loss of the gene pool. And because tomorrow, if there is a problem, if there is a particular insect or anything else that comes in, you won't know where to go. Not at all. I'm not saying again, even a single word against Green Revolution, because that is what has saved millions to die from starvation. And therefore, it's a beautiful technology, and I'm glad it was never subjected to any audit. But post facto, if we start looking at what happened because of Green Revolution, it is that we, first of all, we moved from variety of crops that which were grown by the farmers, largely to cereal based. And with the result, malnutrition had become a problem, because what we are talking today of millets, I should say when we were children, that was, in any case, that was part of our diet. And no one will talk about that it is superfood or whatever. And that also gives surety to our farmers that they will be able to grow something with less of water, with less of resources. So therefore, on the cost of increasing productivity, somewhere we suffer in terms of nutritional security. Let's also look at that the farming, is this a profession that people wants to follow today? The answer to that is again no. Because at the time of independence, perhaps if all economists are here, so maybe my data is not very accurate, but what I know a bit about it is at the time of independence, farmers' income was almost half of average in Indian. But today it is not even 1/5. So why should you follow that profession? The other is, what is farmer growing? Farmer is largely growing what sells in the market, where there is minimum support price announced by the government. And therefore, he's more interested in rice and wheat kind of crops which are being grown. We also very proudly, we mentioned that there is so much of export of water from the country, without realizing that this is essentially virtual flow of water from a country which is already deficit in water. And also the government subsidies, which are going in the form of electricity, again, it is not counted. So you are subsidizing a crop for which some traders will make money by exporting. So we really have to look into those policies as well. And in the long run, how are we going to survive? Now, I don't want to portray everything negative. So let me now come to the positive, that do we have solutions? And I'll say this way, that yes, we do have solutions for most of the things. And of course, more solutions will evolve once we start following those. Now, the very first, and the entire world today is talking about green credits, carbon credits, and so on. Why don't we take them to the agriculture sector as well? Now, what I mean by that, and we are already, Terry is involved in that, and that is promoting agroforestry at farms. That to some extent, like when we are talking of agroforestry, it can not just be the trees which give them money, it can be trees which otherwise also they give them fodder, which can meet other things. And because of the green cover, farmers can earn carbon credits. Now, let me come to another technology. And I'm very proud of it that the scientists at Terry, they have developed that. And that is nanofertilizer. Some of, and of course, IFCO nano products are there in the market for quite some time. And now maybe some of you may not understand what is the difference between a conventional urea versus nano urea. It is something like that if you want to make this water cold, you have various options available to them, to you. You can put this glass on a slab of water, on a slab of ice. It will take some time and heat will also dissipate because it's not just that only this glass will get cold. The other is you put a cube of ice. And the third is that you put very small pieces of ice into it. And the third method is the one where it will get cold in minimum of time and there will be very little wastage of energy over there. Now that is what exactly is nano. You have urea and it's a big molecule for the plant to absorb. And as I explained that the farmers, they usually broadcast urea with hands, they will just put it in their field. But here what you are doing, and maybe this technology would have failed if it was introduced a decade ago, but today with drones, it is possible that you take this nano urea or whatever, any of your DAP, boron, zinc, any of those elements, and you spray it by drones on the expanded leaves. So within 3 to 4 hours, it will be absorbed by the plant completely. So there is no nitrogen which will go to the air. There is no nitrogen which will get leached into the soil. So it's something like the drug. You simply take either intravenous injection if you want a particular drug, or you take medicine, or if you have pain, you just apply it where you want to and not on the entire body. So here also you are just putting it to the plant which requires that much of nitrogen. Now, what is the benefit? I should say it's a win-win technology for everyone because maybe you require just 10% of the total fertilizer, which is otherwise absorbed by the plant. And therefore, the entire subsidy, which is billions of dollars by Government of India, can be saved. I want to correct myself because it can be given to the plant once it has expanded leaves. So a small baby, till it comes to the stage that you can start feeding the child, here also you have to feed to the plant initial urea so that it's robust growing, and then you shift to the nano urea. So therefore, it is something that we are still working. We have to work. Can nano urea be put on the seed and it can take care, it can be absorbed, but those are still under experimentation. What we have also found, and we are doing the emission studies. Now, the second question will be for the farmer, why should I shift? I'm getting subsidy by the government. I know the conventional urea works. So let this technology prove itself over years. I'll make a change after some time. There's nothing for me. If we give them, because see, what we have also done is that what are the savings in emissions? And we found there are savings in emission, GHG emission. Can we give them green credits so that they make more money? And that is where the farmer will be more than willing to make those changes. Let's also look into solarization of agriculture. Now, one point I would like to make over here is that we really need to do a lot of research. We don't want any technology to fail. So the varieties which we are growing today may not be best suited to be grown under solar photovoltaics. What should be the height of solar photovoltaics and so on? Similarly, last point I would like to make, I know the time is short, and that is regarding water, precision agriculture and subsoil irrigation. Somehow we are not moving to technologies which are available today. Like I'll give you one example, and that is direct sowing of rice along with subsoil irrigation will result in reduction in methane emissions, and you can grow, the total consumption of water is less than what is used by wheat today. But again, as I said, because it's subsidized, so for the farmer, somewhere it is reluctance to change. There was one study which we have done with World Bank, and I'm sure it's getting expanded in many other states as well. That was in Punjab. And that was in Hindi, we say, Pani bachao, paisa kamao. So save water, earn money. So of course, there was reluctance on part of the farmer, but we have put meters, how much of electricity is being consumed for agriculture purposes. And our suggestion to government was give them that much of money. Give to the farmer. If you're growing crops, you get X amount of money, which otherwise we are giving you as subsidy in electricity. So then you make the conscious decision, which crop would you like to grow? So that way it would be that they will start growing the crops which are more friendly, sustainable for that particular region for a long time. And the last is precision agriculture, that it requires money. But if you put or only give that much of water to the plant that is required, it's going to save us from disasters in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Super
Dhawan.
interesting.
Lot of information, lot of discussion, lot of things that we can connect with growing up in Delhi and standing at the ration shops in 1960s to get the wheat and rice. But at the same time, let me remind some of us who know, who don't know, that there is a famous Punjabi folk song which talks about millets and how millets were important, because millets were being grown. So I remember that, and also about what you said about we did a study at NCAR with Australian International Agricultural Research Center called Happy Seeder.
Yeah.
Happy Seeder can sow the seeds without burning the stubble, right?
Yeah.
So some of the things I can resonate with, and since I'm running short of time, I welcome Dr. Anshu Bharadwaj to this event. Dr. Anshu Bharadwaj is the Program Director, Energy, Climate and Green Transition at Niti Aayog, all that we have discussed combined in one. He is a former member of the Indian Administrative Service, 1992 batch. He served in with the government of Karnataka. He resigned from IAS in 2007 to help establish the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy, CSTEP, a think tank based in Bangalore. And we know the success story of the think tank. Rahul, you have been associated with in some position. He also functioned as the Chief Executive Officer of Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, a philanthropic organization working on climate and clean energy issues. And we are quite well aware of Shakti Foundation. We've been working closely with them in some of our works. He holds a PhD from the Departments of Engineering and Public Policy and Mechanical Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh. His undergraduate and postgraduate degrees are from IIT Kanpur in mechanical engineering and IIM Calcutta, respectively, the two places. A very warm welcome, Dr. Bharadwaj, and over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the thank you to CSEP for welcome for inviting. Thank you to Professor Hurtle for a very nice presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I'll bring some perspectives based on what we are doing it in the Indian context, responding to your very comprehensive presentation. So we in Niti Aayog in the government are trying to examine some of these trade-offs for India in the context of India's climate mitigation commitments. So India made a pledge of net zero GHG emission by 2070. And we have recently initiated a very ambitious study to examine how India can deliver on the commitment. And as part of that, we set up various interministerial groups to look at different aspects of this transition. CSEP actually is part of many of those groups. Dr. Chadha is in the working group on critical minerals. We also have Terry on many of the working groups, most of the groups. So, and the reason why we set up so many working groups is precisely linked to your presentation. That it's not just a mitigation pledge that India will get from 2.5 tons per capita to net zero. It's for a country like India with a developing economy, it's a very ambitious and different ask as compared to the other countries. For example, what makes India's journey very different is that the developed world is now decarbonizing after achieving very high levels of economic development and per capita emissions. India has a massive developmental agenda ahead of us. With a base of around 3 trillion economy, we want to expand to at least 30 trillion by mid-century and go beyond that. And so the question is, how do we achieve the developmental agenda in a manner consistent with our climate goals? That is very different from what is being done by, say, the developed world. How do we marry developmental priorities with the climate goals? And many studies done by institutions such as CSEP and Terry, our study is still underway. So I will hold on to until the results are out. Suggest that India starting with a base of 2.5 tons per capita, if we were to get to net zero by 2070, quoting other studies, the peak might be around 4 or 5 tons per capita in that range. That's what most scholars have estimated, which study which I have seen. Now imagine starting from a low base of 2.5 tons per capita, peaking around 4 or 5 and getting to zero. That's completely different from done by the rest of the world, where countries are beginning to decarbonize from a base of 9 tons per capita, 15 tons per capita, 20 tons per capita. It's a completely different model. And that too compressed in 50 years. Most transitions historically have taken 100 years, 200 years. This is in span of 50 years. And therefore, the need to carefully examine the kind of trade-offs which you highlighted in your presentation. And I'll give a flavor of few of them in the limited time I have. We have one working group looking at agriculture, which is focused on agriculture, which tries to understand India's growing food demand, how agriculture, which is the subsistence economy with small land holdings, agriculture also is impacted adversely by climate change, how that sector, to what extent it can contribute to mitigation pathways by various interventions. So that is one working group focused entirely on agriculture. We have one working group which looks at the social aspects of transition, in which we are examining the interplay of land, food, energy, water, to see how these different competing pressures on land play out. So that group will throw up some knowledge on them. So to give some example, let's say land and energy. Now, India, based on the studies which I have seen and some results from our own, we are looking to expand the renewable capacity, something in the range of 3,000 gigawatt plus by mid-century and beyond. So right now, our solar and wind installed capacity is about 150 gigawatts. Nuclear is about, I think, 8 gigawatts. And we, on a net zero pathway, this will have to increase something in the range of 3,000 to 3,500, give or take a few. Massive increase, 20 to 25-fold increase from now. Obviously, land implications. Solar has a land implication of, I think, 3 to 4 acres per megawatt. Wind also something like that. So we're looking at a land requirement of around 3 to 4 million hectares for energy in these scenarios. Again, based on studies done by various scholars. Now, if you look at 3 to 4 million hectares, at one level, it may not seem large. You might argue, oh, India has an area of some 328 million hectares. So what we are talking about is 1% of that. So at one level, it's not that large. But if you factor in the fact that out of 328 million hectares, more than half is for agriculture, 25% is dedicated as forest, what you are left with is something like of the order of 40 to 45 million hectares, which is classified as not fit for agriculture or barren land, uncultivable land, or land used for other purposes, which includes urbanization. So we are talking about 3 to 4 million hectares from that pie. And suddenly the equation changes. Because we are a growing economy, pressure of, like Dr. Dhawan was saying, urbanization and those pressures are there. So how do we make sure those trade-offs can be managed in a manner which is socially cohesive for the country has to be carefully considered. Biofuels, another example. Currently, we are producing about 5 billion liters of biofuels, mostly from sugarcane-based sources. Although last year there was some biofuel from ethanol, sorry, from maize and rice as well. At present, we are achieving about 12 to 13% blend with petrol. The target is 20% and probably go beyond that as well. Again, the issue is biofuels. If we were to largely rely on sugarcane and increase sugarcane area, then that comes with a huge trade-off because sugarcane is a very water-intensive crop. So we'll have to go to other crops, let's say rice or maize. Now, if we do that, then rice again is a fairly water-intensive crop, and maize takes a huge amount of fertilizer input. So a need to examine on the life cycle basis, the energy and GHG emissions for biofuels before we take decisions. So we in NITI have initiated this work. We are trying to look at 3-4 different classes of biofuels and look at them from end to end on their life cycle emissions, GHG, energy use, and other parameters which life cycle estimate. So those are important before we take decisions on what options we have. We also, people who work in this area would also know that if we have to use land for energy, then solar and wind on an energy per hectare basis have a much higher footprint as compared to biofuels. So for the same acre of, from the same parcel of land, you can produce much more energy through solar/wind as compared to biofuels on a per hectare basis. That's another thing we need to be kept in mind. And lastly, I'll stop on the issue of land and food. So a report was done by Niti Aayog a couple of years back, and it's on NITI's site, a detailed assessment of India's food demand and supply options, which estimated historical data going back to 50 years and projections next 20-30 years data. The thorough study, the main takeaways from that were 2-3. One is our cereal consumption, rice and wheat, has been declining over the years on a per capita basis. It's been declining. but it's still well above the recommended daily dietary intake. So that's the trend in rice, wheat, and cereal consumption. It's declining, but well above the recommended values. As the economy is prospering and growing, the consumption of others like fruits, vegetables, milk, meat products, and eggs, that is continuously increasing. And that will have an impact on how we use land for our food requirements. That is one. Second, they estimated that if we were to look at India's future food demand and use the current yield numbers, then to meet that demand, agricultural area will have to increase by probably 50% at the current levels of yield. So, which is clearly not sustainable. We don't just are really constrained for land. So the only option for us is to continue to increase the yield of crops on a per acre basis. And there is a lot of room for that. I have the data with me. For example, in case of rice, India's yield is around 2,700 kg per hectare, which is much lower than what is there in the world average, world best practices. There is scope to increase that to around 5,000. Likewise, in the case of maize, we have about 3,000 kg per hectare. There is a possibility to increase that to at least 5,000, maybe beyond, and so on with other crops. So that I think will be very important for us in the next 20, 30 years to meet our food requirements without putting too much pressure on the land. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhagavan, for the insightful comments that we have got. With permission from Dr. Bhandari, can we move 10 minutes beyond? Yes. Because 10 minutes, yeah. Yes. So we have 15 minutes to go. And if there are questions from the audience.
Lots of questions, good.
Yes.
Thank you very much for really one of the most sort of insightful sessions we've had at CSEP, and on issues that we don't, I'm going to say I don't know much about. So just actually taking off from the last point made by Anshu, that looking ahead, India in terms of food, is talking about the changes in diet that are taking place and may accelerate along with urbanization. So the question is that if the diet moves from cereals to non-cereals, to all the things that you mentioned, fruits, vegetables, etc., will that mean more land or less land? Will that mean more water or less water? Will it mean more? I guess it will mean less fertilizer. Okay, the other things don't need fertilizer. And combined with, say, better input usage, the kind of thing that Dr. Dhawan talked about. Can we say that lives for our children will not be so bad?
Two more questions. Yes, you are the next. Yes, please. If you can introduce.
Yeah, I'm Prashantha Roy from the India Hydrogen Alliance. We work on green hydrogen with a lot of help from Terry and Niti Aayog. One elephant in the room for us on the green hydrogen side is fertilizers, because half of the 6 million metric tons of gray hydrogen today is going into fertilizers. Hugely challenging area because it's subsidized 1.7 trillion rupees or $20 billion of subsidy. We've just not been able to crack that. Although now there is a move to do demand aggregation for that, but the delta of gray to green hydrogen is still about $4 to $5. So that's not really happening. I don't know if there are any thoughts on the impact of this direction, hydrogen, which is supposed to be, holy grail and all of that. And, I work for the sector, so I believe in our whatever. But the impact of that on, some of the pictures that you're showing, as an industrial decarbonization strategy, because it is actually huge. 6 million metric tons. If you can actually go green there, we can move a step a little faster toward our 2017 net zero plans.
Thank you. One more question.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating panel. I have two things to say. I'm Niti Rao, fellow at CSEP, and I work on health systems. And some of the, the ecosystem services that was presented, now there is increasingly, some of my colleagues, for example, have been saying that it underestimates the health impacts from these ecosystems. And I know that the IPBES, for example, is beginning to try to address some of that. And I wondered if, some health sector professionals are also part of the ClassNet and maybe also the working groups at Niti Aayog. The second is a question about, particularly the impressive slide on groundwater depletion and the additive effects of all of the different mitigation strategies that you showed. And I just want to take off from what, all of the options that Dr. Dhawan was sharing about how to mitigate it at local levels within, these hotspots, as you mentioned. And I wondered if this kind of modeling can potentially use the aggregate effect of local mitigation efforts. So combination of policies in each of the geographies, and potentially how much could they support to this global overall, depletion levels. And if it's possible to model that based on your, the ones that you have.
Thank you. And I think to do justice to online, I have a question online, and then I'll hand it over to Tom because there are any other questions from this, please.
Here, help
You have
hydrogen.
Karthik, one more
You can
question,
speak to
and then
that.
I go to the online thing. Oh,
It's there in that.
okay. Let me read the online one because the online should not think that they are not being. This is Nicobar from Potsdam Institute. What are the main methodological challenges of connecting aggregate economic model variables to the gridded representation? Is this purely technical exercise, or should we bring in policy measures into the downscaling and upscaling? So a longer question, but Tom, how would you
I get
like
the
to handle
idea.
it? First,
Yeah.
first go to this set.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a mouthful right here. A lot of great questions. I think just covering these, I think we'll cover a lot of territory. Maybe I respond a bit and then I ask my fellow panelists to respond because they're probably more expert on some of these points. Let me speak to the diet question first, because that connects to everything. And I've just come out of a conference where, well, I'm not an expert in that area. That was the main theme. And so here, turning it around a little bit, diets as a driver, diets as a solution. I think there are many papers out there now making the point that we can't achieve sustainability. We can't meet these planetary boundaries without changing diets. Now, the question is how to achieve that. And that's the big issue, but there's no doubt we need dietary change. The folks at PIC, we've got a question from someone at Potsdam. They've been emphasizing this for a number of years. It has huge health benefits as well. So, I mean, it is the silver bullet if we can attain that, because you reduce your caloric intake, so less pressure on the land, you change the mix of things you're consuming. You were raising that question. Shift certainly more towards fruits and veggies. That has implications for labor force, perhaps more than anything, but also potentially mitigating some of the water intensity. And the big health benefits. So diets are definitely very large. I've omitted it here. It's not an oversight, it's just that you can only do so much, and that's well covered elsewhere. But the case is that, it does remain, how do we get there? How do we induce these changes in diets? I know India, I saw the recommended diets in India, no sugar, right across the board. It's challenging, but it does offer, that's the ultimate sustainability solution. Green hydrogen, I'll bump that down the line to one of my colleagues here, or panelists, on the groundwater depletion. That is something our group, I happen to be working with a couple of really bright young scholars from India, and one of those has been using some of this groundwater knowledge, methodological work we've developed to look at groundwater specifically in India. And she's been looking at, she just presented a paper yesterday focusing on some potential adaptation solutions. There's one that's talked about a lot here, was talked a lot about at the conference, increased efficiency. But you risk Jevon's paradox, It turns out from what her work in the Punjab, Haryana area, things are already at the limit. They're not going to expand further there. No Jevons paradox in that context, but other areas she saw that showing up. Irrigation efficiency might actually increase usage. The other thing about irrigation efficiency is if you pump out less here, there's less available downstream. And so they pump more or they need more. So it's a little more complicated than is often portrayed. The other thing she looked at was just, you know, some kind of sustainability limits. But oh, by the way, I love that idea of giving the farmers the money and for the fertilizer and giving them incentive to draw less. And I guess you could do the same on the groundwater front.
Yep.
So sounds like a lot of exciting policy opportunities here. There was one question from our colleague at PIC where I happened to be on sabbatical recently. So you know, they do a lot of great work there. I want to clarify that this is not downscaling. So the climate scientists will often downscale. They get aggregate results, they'll downscale. No, this is bottom up. This is economic modeling at the grid cell level. So how do you get to the aggregate level? You add up. It's not downscaling. So you model the behavior at the grid cell level. You take into account the biophysical characteristics at each grid cell, the policies at each grid cell. You know, the more information you have, the more you incorporate. Then the equilibrium solution emerges and you aggregate up to find out what the total consequences are. We're not figuring the total first and downscaling. A really important difference, say, from the physical scientists and very important for policy. I'll leave it there, but please help me out a little bit.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah,
There,
okay.
so that I can do justice to those who are present in person. There are 3 questions, quick ones, and then I give it to the panelists.
Okay.
Karthik, Sarath, and 2 questions, then 3 questions. Yeah, Karthik. Quick ones, please.
Yeah, my question is a lot more general. Whenever I've seen people do modeling work, the question I have is there are experts here on modeling who have worked across generations and regions. How have you seen the reliance on modeling by policymakers shift? Like, are they more palatable to looking at results of modeling that come out of these papers and imbibe that in policy making? Do you feel that shift is there in terms of accepting it?
Thank you, Sarath. You have a mic.
Yeah, my question is for Tom on the specific slide on the thing where you said that I think 20% depletion and you had the different boxes. I mean, just trying to understand this, is that very, very practical to execute that? And the timelines we're talking, what kind of scale here? And last one is how much kind of cost even we are thinking about?
Wait, the last thing was cost?
Yeah.
Okay.
Last question.
If I may add to what Sharat just said, have you also tried to model the transaction cost involved in, moving from one state to the other, and how, the biophysical limits will then operate is something which I feel is a challenge. That's it.
Thank you. And I know boss is looking at me, and 5 minutes left. I give it 1 minute to you and 2 minutes to the panelists.
Policymakers' acceptance of modeling. If you don't have numbers, you're never going to win the debate. So they may pick and choose which numbers they choose, but it's a numbers game these days if you want to win in a lot of contexts. And that's why the conservation people, the World Bank, were so interested in getting these GDP numbers on their conservation results. But model validation is very important. Economists are weak on that. This gridded modeling, we've been working very hard on that. You can see some historical work, very important in the future. Hydrology time, this chart I showed. It's a great question. What is the time scale? And we have assumed that the producers adjust, that they move from one equilibrium to another, and the trade moves around. So there's a good question there, and transactions costs, obviously highly relevant. We haven't modeled that. We've done much better job on the biophysical side because we're leaning on the scientists there. So that we're just beginning to get into that hydrology area, have a lot more to learn, a lot more to develop. Please. Yeah.
Thank you. Over to you, a couple of minutes each.
Yeah. Well, we have discussed quite a bit about water, and really speaking, I'm quite worried about what's going to happen to agriculture, or rather even drinking water that should be available to citizens of this country. Unfortunately, aquifers, they don't have any regional boundary, and therefore what we do in one part of the country will have direct bearing on other parts of the country. And therefore, there is something which I am convinced we have to put right price to the water. You can definitely give subsidies to the farmers so that they are a little more sensible in terms of usage. One thing, and because today it is, you can't look into agriculture alone. You really have to look into impact of climate change. And as I said earlier, maybe we'll be requiring different varieties. And somewhere it can also be that you go for varieties which are more resistant to the climatic shocks, droughts, floods, all those things, and also go for more of biomass production, and rest of the agriculture residue can be used for energy production, biofuels, and so on. And all that is coupled with how do you conserve water, and therefore more crop per drop. That is something which is going to be applicable. So over there, it's also that farmers should move towards the crops which are more suitable for that particular region. The income of farmers can be increased by number of ways. And of course, it is the availability of energy at rural level so that they can also go for saving perishables, which today we are losing as much as 35–40% of perishables we are losing. So if those are saved, that is something like additional production. And for which through solar energy, you can basically set up cool chambers and so on. So that is going to be another intervention. Plus the biofuel production at village level will also give them skills, and with additional skill set, they can process the food. And then we are also coming up with this plan of solar pumping, and solar power is becoming extremely common. And today we are wasting water because farmer doesn't know what time electricity will come, and therefore they switch it on and they sleep and water is free, so whatever. So over there, it will be that I'm sure they are going to make decision themselves whether they should use that power to pump water or they should put it to the grid and get more money. So that way they'll be more sensible. And as I said, it's also the crops which will sell. I won't worry too much about the dietary choices. And I'll say because it's going in both directions, because non-vegetarians are becoming vegetarians. So that is also a shift which is being done. We should be little more frank in giving or communicating. Like today, it has become a fashion that you consume millets, but at the same time, even in our earlier times, or even when you talk to most of the doctors, they say it shouldn't be more than 30% of your diet. So that is what we need to communicate. And if we look into it, it's only 30%, it's not going to make that much of difference. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhardwaj.
Thank you. 3 very quick points on the modeling. I think it's very highly used. It's very relevant. If you track India's climate policies in the last 20 years, most of them have been based on analytical modeling. TERI has been doing it for many years. NCAR has done. Dr. Chadha himself was at NCAR. So yes, incredibly important to give analytical inputs. How they use it is left to the policymakers, because they have lots of other considerations in decision making. But at least a good data based on analysis based on evidence is important as a great starting point. That's on that. On the agriculture one, I think one thing which was not mentioned is the focus on natural farming, which is being talked a lot in policy circles. Prime Minister himself has often talked about natural farming, and there is a push to promote that. Now, from a policy front, and based on studies that I have seen, there is definitely a decline in the use of water and energy in the farms on a per acre basis. Definite decline in water and energy. The input cost to farmer also goes down because you're not buying fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides. So cost to farmer goes down. What needs to be, I think, established more robustly is the yield of the farms. And I think if there is clarity that there is no yield penalty or yield is higher, then it is surely a win for the farmers. I think that needs to be established with more rigorous studies before it can be taken up for large scale adoption. But if it works out, then it's a very good solution because it addresses the farmers' economy. It addresses the fertilizer subsidy issue as well. But some gaps need to be plugged in my opinion. And lastly, green hydrogen. So, as of now, as you're aware, there's a 5 million ton target and most of it is for exports. There is a cost differential, as you rightly said, between gray and green. I think this tranche of projects will hopefully give us learning on how much that cost differential can be bridged, to what extent, and to what extent green hydrogen has a role to play in the bigger energy mix. So that is one aspect which we are also examining in our study, that if India's net zero plans, what is the role of green hydrogen in different sectors? So once we have clarity, I can share some more analysis.
Thank you very much. And with that, I think we are coming to a close. And one thing that I am reminded, and Tom, you may also be interested, that there is a 14-volume study in the Ministry of Agriculture Cooperation on doubling farmers' income. All that may not be useful, but parts of that study are actually very revealing and useful. Maybe some of you have seen that. Dr. Ashok Dalwai did it, and I did participate in that study as well. So saying thanks to all of you, and I give this opportunity to Ganesh to say a note of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending to those both in person and online. It has been an honor to host Professor Tom Hurtle here. We've been hearing about this visit for a few months now, so very happy to be here. And thank you once again for joining us. And thank you so much to both Dr. Dhawan and Dr. Bharadwaj for their insightful comments on these issues. I think all of us look forward to taking some of these insights into the work we're doing at CSEP and beyond. Thank you also to the entire CSEP events team, Manmeet, Gurmeet, and also my other colleagues at CSEP who've been instrumental in making this event happen. And finally, please do join us for some tea and snacks outside. We'd love to continue the conversation with those who are interested. Thank you once again, and have a good evening, everyone.
You sound like